Welcome to Accelerate OC, the only show focused on the people leading innovation in Orange County. Join our host, Kerry Ransom, in his conversations with the trendsetters, entrepreneurs, investors, and leaders here, because it's time to Accelerate OC.
Good morning. Welcome to Accelerate OC. I'm Kerry Ransom, and thanks always to our engineer, Paul, for making me and my guests sound so good. Today's episode is sponsored by OC4 Venture Studio, which is my home here, and we are building companies, software technology companies of the next generation, and co-piloting and partnering with great founders who want to do that and need capital, they need support, they need coaching, they need everything required to build their world-class company. And if you want to be part of that, you want to be part of the community around building this next generation of companies here in SoCal, you can visit us at oc4v.com. I am super excited to have Nick with me today. And Nick Zasowski is the director of the Global Startup Studio Network, and he's actually joining us from Denver. But he's going to help us accelerate OC from Denver. And part of what Nick and I have really, we've connected on over the last many months is this emerging global network of startup studios. And we were just talking off the air, some people speculate it could be a couple hundred. He's saying it may be as many as 500 that have emerged. And so we're going to talk today about startup studios and what are they, how do they orient in this whole startup world, and whether that's with founders, with corporates, with investors, and where do they fit. And so they've built this really curated and compelling community, couple dozen now global startup studios that are part of their network, as well as a group beyond that as well, and are really helping identify metrics and best practices and a whole bunch of things and trends going on in the world. And so it's been great to get to know Nick and the folks at GSSN over the last many months. And, I think we're really kindred spirits because we think a lot about community and connection and sharing and the kinds of things that ecosystems need, whether it's geographically like Denver or Orange County or Austin or New York or any of the emerging ones here in the States or around the world that are really figuring out how to produce better outcomes, better companies. They really believe in that. Nick believes in that. And so I think we're really kindred spirits around that. We'll spend a lot of time today talking about where I think we both believe studios play this really critical role in the local communities as well. So Nick, it's great to have you here and excited to have you on Accelerate OC this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kerry. Appreciate it. And I couldn't agree more with, I think we'll hear a common thread of community and culture through today's conversation. So thanks for having me. Yeah,
awesome. Well, let's get to the starting line. So as I was saying, we kind of initially connected around this whole topic of venture studios, and you guys are really building this global network of connecting folks. So as you think about this term, and I'll start at sort of the higher level of the term studio. So whether that's startup studio, venture studio, at GSSN, how do you guys really, in your mind, define the term studio?
Yeah, great start. And I'll kick it off too by giving a quick background of GSSN 2. Some of the listeners may be familiar with our parent company. So GSSN, we're owned and operated by GAN, which is Global Accelerator Network. It's a network of 120 accelerators around the globe. And then we also have a curated corporate network as well. So 30 corporations. And last July, we kicked off our curated studio community that's now 24 studios around the globe. And through all of those entities, we have over 13,000 startups that we're working with. So just quick overview of who we are. And yeah, to answer your question, how we define studios and the criteria that we have there. And what we start with first and foremost is studios are company builders. So they're people that are creating companies from scratch, from nothing. And really what they're doing is studios are combining an idea with an entrepreneur that fits to become that CEO for that company that they're creating, and they're solving big problems and then validating them. They have processes around that, and then processes for creating, and then ultimately spinning the company out from the studio on their own 2 feet, and then scaling from there. So if I walk through some of the criteria that we say as far as defining what a studio is, there's really 7 parts to the puzzle. So one would be starting capital for startups. So it's very capital intensive to run a studio, because again, you're starting this from scratch. So you're the ones, or studios are the ones that are putting their money where their mouth is. And I'll take a step back when I say startup studios around the globe. It's venture studio, like OC4, startup studios, all the same words, company builders and venture builders. So I do want to make that statement there, that they're all they're all a similar model to us as we're defining this. And then number 2 would be funding for studio operations. So you're also having to fund that yourself. So it's capital intensive to raise money for your startups. It's also capital intensive to run your own studio. There's teams of 40 that are creating 2 to 3 companies a year out there at these studios. Then an equity stake and a pretty, and we say that the minimum equity stake for a venture studio is at least 15% that you're taking in the company. When you start to trickle down below there, you start to bleed into the accelerator space. So keeping those lines black and white. And then resources, so providing a plethora of resources so that the CEO can just build product and sell. And then all the administrative stuff is taken care of on the back end by the studio in those earlier days, because that's what generates that capital efficiency and able to grow quicker. And then a set term. So it's not an incubator. It's not a place where you go and just hang out with your company or get resources and slowly work on projects. The average for a startup in a studio from creation to when it raises that seed round and leaves is 6 to 18 months is what we see in the industry. And then again, we talked about this. Your creators, studios are creators. They're the ones that are actually starting the company from day one. And then the final and 7th criteria piece that we look at is just a strong team. This is something that's really important, because networks are really important in building companies. And does the studio have a strong team? And are you bringing in strong founders? Because that's really important as you start raising money and going out and building and growing your own team. So yeah, that's how we would really define studio. So hopefully that sets a good foundation for today.
That's a great foundation. I mean, I think my experience last year when we were really starting to explore if the studio model was really the model that we wanted to try to build toward, I think, most of those criteria were part of those conversations. And as you know, people are experimenting with variances around that all along a continuum. I mean, I've yet to find 2 that are identical. Yeah. I'm sure you probably have, but I feel like there's just, maybe it's with that many different elements plus all the variables of the people involved or the industry or the geography or what have you. We sort of look at, hey, we don't want to reinvent anything that is working in other places. Like that's part of the value of a studio, is you're trying to get a tremendous amount of leverage and repeatability. So we've been trying to find others we can beg, borrow, and steal from, for sure. But there still is a lot of uniqueness that I find in each one.
Yeah, and it's almost like a funnel where Accelerators, right? We all have a pretty good idea of what accelerators are, and yes, there's things that differ here and there on accelerators, but studios are still earlier as far as the number of studios out there, and I think we're in the middle of that funnel where at the bottom of it it's going to be pretty standard, but we're still working through kinks as studios as about processes. So, yeah, good point.
So I mean, when we think about it, like at OC4, when we think about the Venture Studio, and my partner and our team that we've put together, because I couldn't agree with you more that like the value of that core studio team is critical, and we've taken our time to build that team because we want the best of the best. We're really focused on Southern California, and we now have someone in LA who is our head of data and technology, who, most recently was the head of data science at Bird, the scooter company in Santa Monica, and had a 50-person data science team, and but he's willing to go in and teach a founder who doesn't know a lot about machine learning or data architecture how to do it, and can develop that junior talent underneath him over time that will help our studio really start to scale. And then our head of product, who has built TurboTax at Intuit, and is head of product at GoDaddy, and just has that product centric methodology that we think, again, we can go teach a lot of other people how to do this in a very predictable, repeatable way. So we're really focused on that operating experience and the leverage that you can get from really strong foundation and strong methodology. So as you look at other studios around, who do you feel like is really doing that well from a operational excellence standpoint?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I would just double down on your comment, or both of our comments around the team stuff. Like when I talk to successful studios, they say the number one thing is, do you have a founder at your studio that's really well connected in the investor world, and someone that's really well connected on the talent front and for future entrepreneurs and founders. So the team that you're building as you're building a studio is really important. And from an operating standpoint as well, in giving those examples. So the first one that comes to mind is Pioneer Square Labs out of Seattle. They have 5 managing directors, and they all have strengths in very different areas, and it's strategic and on purpose, and they're able to fill a lot of the gaps early in the stages of creating these companies because they each have their own expertise there. And then I would say another one is eFounders, which is out of Paris, France, and Brussels, Belgium. And they have 2 founders that they're probably the most hands-on studio founders that I know of around the globe. And their portfolio in January just eclipsed $1 billion with 24 companies. And then over the last couple months, they had a company called AirCall that just blew it out of the water amongst all of the coronavirus stuff. They were one of those companies that just ended up taking off. So they're another one where they've started companies in the past, and they're really hands-on for that first 6 months of their companies. And then another example, which I think they're all different, is High Alpha out of Indianapolis, Indiana. And they have an ex-founder, Scott Dorsey, as well as other investors and founders on their team that is leading their startups as well, and they're able to leverage their networks and their expertise in helping their startups. So those are 3 that come to mind when I think of strong teams that are able to leverage their expertise in helping these founders get off the ground when they're earlier in their career. So yeah,
that's helpful. Thank you. So as you think about, I don't think we've talked about this previously, if you think about the kinds of talent that you think thrives in a studio. So we're building our team here to then work in a portfolio of companies.
Yeah.
As you think about the types of talent, are there personality characteristics? Are there anything that you guys have really honed in on and said, these are the types of folks that really seem to thrive in a studio environment?
Yeah, this is where I think it really depends on what your studio is looking to do and looking to accomplish, and how you want to vet the founders that are coming in. I know of a studio that's down in Mexico. The guy running the studio literally will be in an Uber ride, and he has conversations and asks certain questions, and he'll grab somebody that may not even be thinking about starting a company, and he's run some successful companies out of the studio Agave Lab. And then there's other ones that have it broken down to a science, and when I think of those, they're more trying to figure out, okay, first, are you a culture fit for our studio? What's our culture? What are we looking for? Are we looking for the founder that's going to grind it out for 80 to 100 hours a week? Or are we looking for someone that's excited about both balance and working hard for a 40-hour week? And where I see people doing this really well are Human Ventures out of New York City, and We Are Builders. They're out of the Netherlands. The two of them have it down to a pretty scientific method, and part of it from the Human Ventures side specifically is they bring in founders in advance and work with them for 90 days and just work on ideas together to get it
almost EIR like, it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, entrepreneur in residence is very popular term thrown out there in the studio world, and it's almost a way to interview the founder before committing, because it is it's a marriage essentially that you're committing to.
Sure.
It's very long term when you bring these founders in. So yeah.
Well, let's go a little bit deeper on that. I mean, it's been interesting for us. We're about 6 months in. We have a handful of companies, and our model, I think you have some familiarity with this. We had this studio vision, but we did it from a running start, and so we made an we've invested in several of these companies, what may look a little bit more like a traditional venture investment. And then we've also gotten an investment of our team and earned equity that way. So our equity stakes actually, in most cases, are a hybrid of capital that we've actually invested into the company, and I would say time, if you will, that we've invested from our team. And as we've gotten farther along, we actually are seeing we can invest maybe a little bit more capital and a little bit more time. And so our equity stakes are actually increasing. And we're now looking more like a studio than we probably did in the very beginning, which is partly the startup way to evolve our way there. And the reason I sort of give that background is part of what we are trying to find is like, what is that right stage, and also the right equity stake. So on the stage standpoint, some of the folks we met early on, they were already somewhat underway. They might have already had a product, they might have already had even a customer or prototype, and then we're coming in to gap fill in the areas where they need help. As we're getting farther along, we're actually going earlier. To your point earlier, we're like most startup studios, it's blank sheet of paper, and they're starting from day one. And I think we're trying to find that place, to be able to do some of that, but also meet people where they are, because some founders get a little bit down the path only to realize, oh, I'm going to need a lot more help with this. And we feel like there's still a place there. So how do you think about that from a, how strict and stringent? Because I think it is, for a lot of them, probably easier to say, hey, let's do everything from a blank sheet of paper. And I think that's the more common approach that I've now seen out there. We see a lot of founders, some cases they're even floundering. They've been at it for 6 months or a year, and then we could just be that catalyst to really help them take off.
Yeah. And so yes, I've seen it done both ways at studios. I know a lot of studios, they'll do, whether it's happy hours or like luncheons, and people come in and they just pitch their ideas, and whether they know they're over their head already or they're just wanting to partner with somebody that has a good network or expertise. That's really up to the studio. If I encourage entrepreneurs, if you're passionate about an idea and maybe you're not confident in being the CEO, but you still want to be a co-founder of the company, a studio would be a great opportunity to just go even validate your idea, right? Because that's I think that's 90% of like the job of studios is they're creating hundreds of ideas a year, and they're validating those, and then they're only creating maybe 3 to 4 companies a year, or continuing forward if the company's already started on those ideas every year. And I think half the battle is trying to figure out that those first influx months, if you're doing it alone, those could be years, versus you could find out in a couple months or in a couple weeks, even if your company is something that's going to be sustainable and scalable down the road. So yeah, does that answer the
I think so. I mean, it's there, there've been obviously historically a lot of different ways to start companies. I mean, a big part of our story to the market is, hey, this is a much more predictable path. And whether it's validate your idea or help you figure out you need to pivot earlier, we've tended thus far to focus less on our ideas and more on the marketplace, and saying, sort of your point, like, hey, we'll let the ideas come in, and then we'll see if they're a good culture fit with the capability we have, with how we orient, and are these founders. And we're seeing, it's interesting, we're seeing some first-time founders that we feel like we can work really well with, and we can grow them. Part of having done so many startups for so long, I see this great even mentorship opportunity to help turn some of these founders into way better CEO operators than they might be able to be on their own, which is really fulfilling for me. And then in other cases, we're seeing founders who have done this before saying, oh, this is so helpful, because you'll take on all these things that I know now how much distraction and overhead that is, that I'd love to have access to this great talent and also this set of services that I don't have to worry about in those early stages. So, and I can focus on what I really want to do.
Yeah. And so those are like 2 great buckets of people that are perfect fit for a studio. Is like, the first time founder that still needs some support, the second time founder that is like, I don't have to deal with any of the administrative stuff, and I can just build and grow and scale. And then I would put a third bucket for a founder, which is the second or recurring, the like second time founder, but they don't have an idea. And that's where, if you come up with an idea, or if you're a second time entrepreneur, maybe reach out to your local studio. Be like, hey, I don't have any ideas, but I've grown and scaled a company before, and I love doing that. And these are some of the problems that I get excited about solving for, and go in that direction. So I think that's a great way to look at it, is those 3 buckets.
Those are 3. Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's been this explosion in studios over the last few years as far as the number of them. What do you attribute that to?
Yeah. And just to give everybody context that may not be familiar with studios, so 1996 was the founding of the first studio, which in your neck of the woods, everybody might be familiar with, but Idea Lab was founded then. And then the next ones weren't founded until 2007 to 2011. Some of the writings on studios, they call it the first wave. And the first wave was like 3 studios. So it was Rocket Internet, which is out in Europe, and BetaWorks, which is in New York. And then you have the next wave, which is 2013 to 2017. And that was roughly 80. So now we're at 80 studios worldwide. So it's still not very many. And those are ones like Atomic, people are probably familiar with, Expa, which is also in the area for, both of them are in the area in California for you all. And then in 2020, as you mentioned earlier, we're now, I mean, it can range from 200 to 500 depending on your definition of studio and who you talk to. But it's growing a lot. And to answer your question, my opinion of like what's both caused the boom and the popularity, I think the early ones did really well, like Idea Lab. We all know was doing
Honestly,
really well.
yeah, I still call it Bill's Ideas, but
yeah, there you go. I haven't heard that one, so I like that. So yeah, Bill's Ideas did really well, and in that, people started to turn an ear to it and think about it. But I think what caused the slow approach is it's so capital intensive, as we've talked about. So early on, people are looking at it, and it's like that's so much money to put in so few ideas. But as you can put processes around it, and as more people started seeing it work, yes, it's a few bets, but they're very targeted investments because they're companies that you're validating and you're vetting through, or you're hearing about in the market, or these entrepreneurs are coming to you with these ideas, and you have more control because it's from the day of creation, right, of this company. So I think now as people are seeing more and more of that, people are latching onto it, especially with the past couple of years and just more capital going around. And personally, call me an optimist, I think studios are gonna like double in the next few years, because now with everything going on in the coronavirus world, more than ever, you need to be able to pivot really quickly. And studios are in a position to do that because you're creating companies from scratch. So, okay, well, those ideas aren't going to work anymore. What ideas are?
Sure.
Let's just start building in that direction. So,
yeah, and I mean, I'm going to take a little issue with your concept of capital intensity, in that I look at it like at the end of the day, it takes capital to build companies, but how you deploy it and use it is where I just see it. It's a trade, in that, like I said, if I take 10 companies that I'm going to invest in, let's say I'm going to give each of them $1 million, they're going to turn around and they're going to go have to hire people and hire services and put system infrastructure and all these things in place. And I would argue that's more capital intensive with less leverage, because each of them is trying to figure it out on their own.
Yeah.
And there's so much duplication of effort and infrastructure. And a big part of what we continue to look at is how do we leverage a lot of the investments. I mean, and we look across these companies, in any area. I don't care if it's a system or it's a process or it's a person. It's kind of, all of it is up for evaluation from our perspective to say, we may be able to be way more capital efficient here by doing it this way. And now in number of companies all get the benefit of that. And so I even think of it from a talent standpoint. I've done this now for over 20 years. And so I go, this idea that I need this full-time person in my company is in many cases maybe just a psychological validation for me as the founder, more than it is practical good use of resource. And so I think as a studio, we can challenge those kinds of assumptions with a focus on being super capital efficient. So that I'm curious how you think about that.
Yeah. And I guess where I was going with that comment, I totally, that's a great nudge, because the average starting capital that studios are putting into their startup on day one is $500,000, and that's giving them, say, a year, 18 months runway. But at the end of that 6 to 18 months of them using that money, they're raising their seed round, which when you look at other industry standards, which I think so it takes them 6 months to get there, and then it only takes a studio just under 4 months or just under 5 months to raise the seed round. if you're doing it on your own, like the other industry averages are over 7 months just to raise it. And then even getting to that seed round in the first place, it's not 6 months that you're getting there. It's taking a lot longer to get to that seed stage. So that's, and I think that's where you're going is like, are you going to choose to do it on your own and move along a little bit slower? And that starts to drain you of resources when you're doing it that way, or doing it with studios where they can give you a bunch of money and capital on the forefront, and then you can just move really fast. It becomes a flywheel, and they have the processes, and you're just able to go. So yeah, that's a good. I like that.
So let's move a little bit over to the investor side. So we were talking a little bit off the air. I think in some cases we've felt a little of this in that explaining a single company to an investor is seemingly an easier explanation than this, as I call it, a company building company, right? Because that's, as we think about OC4, we really view ourselves as we're building a company building company. And that now has the potential to be something someone could invest in, and they're investing in the know-how and the leverage there, but they're also investing in this portfolio that gets built, and we own a portion of this whole portfolio as well, right? So it's kind of this hybrid between what a fund investment might look like and investing into a portfolio through a fund and this operating entity. So how have you seen studios really effectively explain themselves to the investor community?
Yeah. So first, I'm going to start with the investors and just give a quick challenge to investors. If you're not aware of the model, start leaning in and asking questions and being just like genuinely curious about what's going on in the studio world, because I think this comes from two sides. And one friend that I know, her name's Sarah Anderson over at Centrifuge. And they're doing a really good job of just like, we need to learn more. We need to understand this because this is asset class that's growing really, really fast. Why is that? And just asking a ton of questions. So that'd be my nudge to investors, to start reaching out and just researching who studios are, to start talking to them. And then for the studio, now I lost my train of thought. What was
how are you seeing people effectively explain this to
So I would just say we've been talking about capital efficiency and how we're explaining it. And I would just say that one of the core things is just the speed that studios are able to move compared to the other investments that VCs are investing in. And I pulled some data just to be able to put numbers behind this. But the average, so we talked about the time, right? So it takes roughly 2 months. It's 2 months quicker just to raise a seed round from startups and studios versus your average startup. And these seed rounds are coming from the day of creation 6 months later. So that's pretty quick. And then number two is the average seed valuation. And I know these aren't all Silicon Valley averages, or the averages across the globe, but 4.1 million is the average valuation at the seed round for a studio startup. And for the industry, it's 3.5. So, and then 12 months after leaving, this is studio versus accelerator, but the 12 months after leaving a studio, startups are raising on average $2.4 million, and accelerators, the 12 months that startups leave the accelerator, is $550,000.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
Yeah. So I think as we continue to get more data in the industry and are able to share this information, it's going to become even more and more obvious that studios are more efficient in the way that they're building companies and the way that their companies are raising money and succeeding, by taking these small bets, putting a bunch of resources behind these companies and just helping them move really fast.
So how, and then, from your perspective, how does that translate through to the investor? I mean, as I think about it, it's, hey, we're more capital efficient. That means very likely less dilution, which means we're going to own more of the company, which means even at lower exits, we're going to get better return multiples, which flows all the way through. Like the investor and even the entrepreneurs, the more capital efficient you are, that equity pie is just cleaner. And, that tends to benefit everybody. And at least that's how we think about it. The other we talk about is this idea that you're going to have more winners, and that is actually just a net positive for an ecosystem. That the more people that succeed, the more confidence that builds, the more likely they're going to want to do that again. And when you have a fund with 10 investments and really 1 out of 10 really works out, those other 8 or 9 that, those people may not have the fortitude to go through that again. And I think that part of the whole, from our perspective, the studio model is showing success, and that success breeds success and confidence. So any thoughts you have around that?
I was just going to double or add to that of speaking to the community piece of things too, that we touched on at the very beginning. But OC4, when you've created these companies and we're now 5 years down the road, let's say half of them have exited, this is both generating new wealth in your community. It's creating new jobs. Kaufman did a study that all the new jobs, especially during recessions, come from companies that are 0 to 5 years old. So you're the job creators in your ecosystem. And then ultimately it's just creating more knowledgeable entrepreneurs in your ecosystem. That's then just going to snowball. So you're going to tip of the iceberg as you get this thing rolling and moving forward from there. So,
That's awesome. So, you're in Denver, as I said earlier. How do you think about Southern California as you look at you guys are looking globally, but let's stay in the States for now. How do you think about Southern California relative to other parts of the country over the next several years?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of opportunity when I look at Southern California. Maybe it's just because San Francisco steals all the headlines for California, but I see a ton of talent via really large companies. There's a ton of big companies and a ton of big industries, whether it's Hollywood and entertainment. The sports scene out there is incredible. And in California, just like the sheer size of the city, there's just a lot of people in the Los Angeles area and Orange County. So I just see a lot of opportunity. And then I look again at studios and I see science is doing well. Bill's ideas.
Idea Lab still doing well.
Yeah, it's doing really well. And now with you all like joining in, there's tons of room for opportunity in your community. And I just, when I look at Southern California, I'm like, there's so much to be had there, and so much opportunity, and so many entrepreneurial thinking people. I mean, I think the entertainment industry is just the same way with people trying out for gigs and things like that. I think it's a very entrepreneurial, spirited city when I think of the LA.
Well, so, I mean, those are some of those are the original studios in Hollywood, right? Like,
there you go. Yeah. So now you're just changing you're adding a new dynamic to the word studio from the entrepreneurial side of things. So
that's right. So Paul's given me the time sign here, Nick. Couple other quick things I wanted to go through. As you think about companies and studios, right? I mean, one idea is that a company could, like a bigger corporate, could try to set up their own studio. How do you think about that idea versus them partnering with studios that are on the outside? Because often the challenge inside the company is how to set up the right kind of program and incentives that may not work under that corporate setting. So how do you think about bigger companies partnering with a studio like ours or others?
Yeah, I am 100% in the direction, I should say 90%, I shouldn't say anything's 100%, but of corporations partnering with studios. And the reason why I say that is because it's hard for corporations to get out of their own way. Corporations are set up and structured in a certain way to move through your processes in a specific format. And what makes startups and entrepreneurs and studios such an asset is they can move and break things really quickly. And corporations are built so those things don't happen quickly and they happen slowly. And as we've seen, a good book to read is New to Big, and it talks about innovation in corporations. And it's like, you got to move outside of the corporation. So I've seen corporations do it well, where they create a different entity that's outside of it as well. But I think partnering with a studio where it's these people, where it's like you're in this every day, and you're in the entrepreneurial ecosystem in your community, you know the ins and outs, and I think it's just really important that partnering with a studio like you just get that subject matter expertise, as well as just taking a step away from their processes. So
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for that perspective. So final lap here. One of the things I always ask my guests to do is share a piece of advice or key lesson, something sort of core to them. So as you think about, you mentioned the Kauffman Foundation, we need more startups. We do. We need, those are the job creating engines. As you think about, prospective startup founders or early founders that are out there right now, what advice or lessons would you love to leave with them?
Yeah. I think one thing, this has been our team's rallying cry over the last 3 months during the COVID times. And it's this quote that one of my teammates shared with us. And it's, "Our world has changed, which means our clients' jobs have changed, which means that our jobs have changed." And I think in that quote is just, as founders, we need to be flexible and able to move and be dynamic with the environment, because if we're not, then we'll be left behind as the world just continues to charge ahead. So that's one that we've just been sitting on a lot lately. So
that's great.
Yeah.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for joining me today. I mean, what a fun conversation. Obviously, we're both living this day in and day out. I think that there will be a lot of people that get a lot of value out of this conversation. And part of why I like to record these is that, there's a lot of education in here. And thanks for all you're doing on a global stage to connect and collaborate and share all the great work that is happening from a bunch of creative entrepreneurs that are trying to build these building companies like we are here at OC4. Thanks for being the great promoter of the studios around the world. And I appreciate you guys, all you're doing. And as I said from the outset, you're helping to accelerate OC even from Denver. So thanks for joining.
Yeah, no, thank you, Carrie. Thanks for having me. Love having these conversations, and keep it up with everything you're doing to impact the community there. So
thank you.
Appreciate what you do.
You've just listened to Accelerate OC. Join our live recordings every Tuesday morning at accelerateoc.com, or listen, like, and share anytime from your favorite podcast spot. Let's accelerate OC together.